Please join me in giving Ben Rast a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
After the opening comments by John, I want to make it absolutely clear that I am not running for anything, and I have never run for anything. I have never been elected to any post. If nominated, I will not run. If elected, I will not serve. Pardon? You're probably safe here today. I'm safe here. Okay, good, good. Well, it is a wonderful treat to be here with you. This is my first ever trip to Wichita and my first ever trip to Kansas. And although the temperature is chilly, I can tell you the hospitality is very warm, and I greatly appreciate that. Can I see a show of hands in the room? How many people have heard of or read something by Bastiat, Frédéric Bastiat? Okay, great. I see some open minds in the room that we will encourage to take a look at Frédéric Bastiat. First of all is how to pronounce his name. You know, the French, who do everything a little bit differently, put a lot of silent letters in their language, and the T is silent, so his name is Bastiat. Bastiat was born in 1801, right at the beginning of the Napoleonic Wars. He died in 1850, right after the French Revolution of 1848. The France of his time was, I think he would say, a complete and total mess. And if you ever despair at the world that you see in the United States, and it's very easy to do that, look at the rest of the world or look at France. I have the privilege of traveling a little bit. About a month ago, I was in Guatemala at the Universidad Francisco Marroquín, a fantastic free market institution of higher learning in Guatemala, of all places. And when you listen to the people who live in Guatemala and the challenges they face, it makes the challenges we face look completely different. We have a Bastiat Society in Venezuela, of all places. And they not only have to be very careful about where they meet, they have to be very careful about what they say. It could cost them their property, and it could cost them their lives. So as dismal as the United States may appear on those occasions when you're ready to despair and give up hope, I would say consider the rest of the world, or consider what Frédéric Bastiat said about his own France. Here's how he described the country he was in. France is the most governed, the most regulated, the most imposed upon, the most harnessed, and the most exploited people in Europe. France also leads all other nations as the one where revolutions are constantly to be anticipated. And it's no exaggeration, France was in one revolution right after the other. These are not elections. These are not bitterly contested primaries. These are outright revolutions. And yet in the middle of this life, which was painfully short, only 49 years, he died of what we think might have been throat cancer. Even though he lived a painfully short life, and he lived in a painfully disturbed and upset country, he was still quite an optimist. Had a good sense of humor, and was a very clear communicator. By the way, I have a theory about Bastiat, and that's why I think the reason he doesn't garner the intellectual respect that I think he deserves is because he wrote very clearly. Okay. Have you noticed that respect for intellectuals goes up as clarity goes down? Well, Bastiat was all about the clarity, and he was working on his great magnum opus, his systematic vision of economics, when he passed away in 1850, so we only have that partially. So why does the Bastiat Society exist? What are we trying to accomplish? Well, back in 2004, I and another businessman named Walter LaCroix sat down, and we decided that there was too much negativity in the world. People were convinced the world was getting worse, nothing good was happening, and we needed a positive message. We needed a positive message of free market economic change. We didn't want that message to be political. We wanted it to be completely apolitical. That's why the Bastiat Society is a 501c3. It's an education private foundation. It is not a political action committee. We invite anyone who is interested or at least curious about how economies really work to join us in our meetings. The idea that we had in 2004 was that Bastiat Society would scatter across the world like Rotary clubs, and that soon we'll be able to drive into any town or village anywhere, and there'll be a Bastiat Society meeting of anywhere from 2 people to 200 people. We just didn't know how this was going to work. We ran it as a single meeting club for a long time in Charleston, South Carolina. And then we finally decided that in order to make this thing grow, we had to expand. We had to start hiring someone who could run it as a full-time organization. We hired Brad DeVos, who's been in Wichita. And Brad is now taking us international, and we are very optimistic that we will be truly global all over the world, in every town, city, village, burg, and ville. And soon you'll be able to drop in like a visiting Rotary member at a Bastiat Society. What are we trying to accomplish? We're just trying to accomplish connecting business people who are interested in market economies and how market economies work with this vast reservoir of material that validates that belief. Most of us have a hunch about the way the world works. Thomas Sowell calls it a precognitive vision in the book A Conflict of Visions. Most of us have a hunch about the way the world works, and we spend a lot of time looking for factual evidence in the world that validates that hunch. So what we want to do is take the business people who have a hunch about the way the world works and connect them with this vast reservoir of intellectual material produced by universities, scholars, and think tanks all around the world that validates that hunch, to feed that positive energy of social change, positive human service, prosperity all around the world. Bastiat was our role model for this because, as I said, he never despaired in the face of overwhelming odds, and he never lost his sense of humor. That's why we named it the Bastiat Society. By the way, my license plate, my South Carolina license plate, is Bastiat. And when I put it on my license plate, my daughter number 3, middle child, you know what I mean by that, okay? Middle child said, "Oh, Dad, don't do that. It's so embarrassing." I said, "Well, why does it embarrass you? What's wrong with it?" She said, "Dad, it looks like a bad word in a foreign language. You can't drive around Columbia with that on your license plate." And I said, "But Colleen, I'm educating people, and as I'm driving around, people will say to me, 'Who is Bastiat?'" And sure enough, people did ask the question, but they didn't ask, "Who is Bastiat?" One guy asked me, "I know you have a BA, but what is it in? BA in what?" People would ask all kinds of questions. There's only one other state that I know of a license tag Bastiat, and that's in Indiana. David Hart, who is a real Bastiat scholar at the Liberty Fund in Indianapolis, has an Indiana state license tag Bastiat, which means there's a great opportunity for someone in Kansas, okay? I would encourage you to consider getting it, taking the picture, and then sending it to me. I'd love to have it. My goal there is to have all 50 states and the District of Columbia on a poster with Bastiat license plates. My sons, on the other hand, did not think it looked like a bad word in French. I asked them, "What do your friends think my license plate says?" And my son said, "Dad, we just tell them that it means badass in French." This too could be you. But back to Bastiat. As I said, born in 1801, died in 1850. France was a complete mess, but he never stopped trying to make it better. And he wrote many things, one of which you can pick up as you leave here today, called The Law. He wrote The Law very close to the end of his life. It's only about 87 pages long, and it's an explanation of the proper functioning of the law. And Bastiat basically says there are 2 ways laws can work. One is to protect people and their property, and that is the viable, the justifiable, and the reasonable use of law. But there's another use of law, and that is to plunder other people's property, and that's the word he uses, plunder. He calls it legal plunder. And he also says that is the law perverted. the law misused, and the law abused. And only in 87 pages, he lays out a brilliant case for law as protection versus law as plunder. Now, another reason we picked Bastiat was because it's only 87 pages. And so if you're trying to convince someone to at least consider an opposing viewpoint, and you hand them Atlas Shrugged, good luck, right? But an 87-page pamphlet called The Law, maybe you might have a chance they will read it. Now, by the way, I've got nothing against Atlas Shrugged. I've actually read it twice, except for the very long John Galt monologue in the middle where I said I got it and I skipped it. I hope I won't offend anybody in here who's an Ayn Rand fan, but got it, skipped it. So Bastiat was a brilliant, clear, and humorous communicator. So for the purpose of this trip, I thought, well, I want to talk to business people. I want to get business people interested in the way things work. Most importantly, I want to change, and this is going to sound a little creepy, and I apologize, I want to change the business culture operating system. And by that, I mean I want to open people's minds and hearts to the possibilities of the consequences of decisions they might make as a business person that they otherwise wouldn't think about. Simply put, it's like this. A business person during the day has to make all kinds of very rapid-fire decisions. And Friedrich Hayek, another great free market thinker, would say that's perfectly okay to make these decisions on the basis of very condensed knowledge. Hayek calls it an economy of knowledge. In fact, Hayek goes one step further and he says, you know, in order to be really good at most of what we need to do in this world, we don't have to know very much. We just have to know something that other people think is valuable and are willing to pay for or trade, right? Have you ever asked the question or been asked the question, if he's so smart, why isn't he rich, right? That's a very popular question. If he's so smart, why isn't he rich? And the answer is because you don't have to be smart. As a matter of fact, there are studies that say high IQ is not high correlated with wealth accumulation. There are studies that say if you go into somebody in the back, good, thumbs up. There are studies that say if you take a group of high school students and you say which one of these high school students will be the most successful in terms of wealth accumulation, business creation, entrepreneurship, those types of things, and you have your A students, your B students, your C students, your D students, and your F students. Guess which group is going to be the most successful at wealth accumulation and business creation? It's the BC student, okay? The A students can almost be their own worst enemy. They're brilliant, they're incredibly logical thinkers, but they forget to cash checks, they don't balance their checkbook, they forget to pay the property tax bill, they forget to file their income taxes, you know. These are geniuses that don't have any real functioning operating system in the real world. The DF students, they never seem to recover, okay? But it's the BC student that actually is grounded in the world and operates well in that world. So, you don't have to have very high levels of intelligence to operate very well as a business person. So that answers the question, if he's so smart, why isn't he rich? And the answer is because high levels of intelligence might actually work against common sense and operating systems in the world. It also works against taking the big picture. That is, a person who is very good at operating in the world very rarely surfaces and looks at the entire social infrastructure and asks the question, what makes this all possible? Or how do we make it better? How do we not just make business better? How do we make the social operating infrastructure or the operating system better? All too often, the first thing they try to do is solve the problem politically. You know, we'll just elect the right people and that will solve the problem. No, it won't, okay? Politics is an important part of the solution, but it cannot be the only solution. And by the way, Bastiat said exactly that. If you think you can fix the world by passing a law, good luck with that. That hasn't worked before, not going to work now, won't work in the future. You can't just pass a law to improve the world. You have to improve the way people think about the world and the incentives that are put in front of people. So I thought it would be an interesting exercise to take a look at Bastiat and say, what does Bastiat say about business? I pulled out 8 things, so this is going to be pretty short. and a few quotations from Bastiat that illustrate what I think he's trying to accomplish. To put this into context, in a book called Economic Sophisms, and by sophisms he meant things that aren't true that everybody believes are. Okay? So Economic Sophisms in 1845, he wrote, "In the sweat of thy face thou shalt eat bread. But everyone wants as much bread and as little sweat as possible." And that is the beginning of our discussion about Bastiat. It leads us right into the question of human nature. How are you wired? What do you want? Why do you want it? Point number one from Bastiat on business. You must understand human nature. Most importantly, your own. It's dangerous, very dangerous, for any of us to imagine that we are made of finer clay than the people around us. George and I were talking yesterday about Will and Ariel Durant and their magnum opus, the Civilization series. And there's a quotation in the middle of that series, and I think it's in Our Oriental Heritage, where he says, "The only reason we have laws is because we are convinced that our neighbor needs them." So it is very dangerous to imagine that you are qualified to run another person's life or to rule over the person. It is best maybe to concentrate on yourself. Here's what Bastiat says about human nature. Self-preservation and self-development are common aspirations among all people. And if everyone enjoyed the unrestricted use of his facilities and the free disposition of the fruits of his labor, social progress would be ceaseless, uninterrupted, and unfailing. By the way, by that, he meant what he called economic harmonies, which was the name of the book he was working on when he passed away. Okay? If you have the right social order, things just work. If you don't have the right economic order, people will use it to enrich themselves. He continues. But there is also another tendency that is common among people. When they can, they wish to live and prosper at the expense of others. This is no rash accusation, nor does it come from a gloomy and uncharitable spirit. The annals of history bear witness to the truth of it. The incessant wars, mass migrations, religious persecutions, universal slavery, dishonesty in commerce, and monopolies. This fatal desire has its origin in the very nature of man, in that primitive, universal, and insuppressible instinct that impels him to satisfy his desires with the least possible pain. I would like to point out that in the middle of a long list of human misery, he includes these very important words: dishonesty in commerce. Bastiat viewed that as no less an act of plunder than slavery and war. I think that's pretty powerful business advice. Be very careful about your own human nature, and don't let it lead you to live well at the expense of others. Bastiat on business number two. There are only two ways to accumulate wealth. Only two. One is to earn it, and the other is to steal it. And there are only two ways to steal wealth. One is to use a gun, and the other is to use the legislature. Bastiat called that legal plunder. And he said, it looks clean, it looks sanitized, it looks socially acceptable, but it is no less an act of violence than using a gun. Now, people who would not dream of assaulting their neighbor to enrich themselves, unfortunately, unthinkingly, will use regulation and legislation. I think if they stopped and said, what am I really doing here, they wouldn't do that. So Bastiat on wealth accumulation says simply this: two ways, You can earn it, you can steal it with an act of violence. No one wants to do that. Everybody understands that that is wrong. By the way, if you're in this room and you don't think that violence is wrong, you are a psychopath. But sanitized violence somehow passes muster. So I think we need to stop and ask ourselves, are we really willing to accept sanitized violence as a method of enrichment? I've tried to teach my children things. I'm not sure that I can. I'm not sure that I do. I started out imagining that I was going to be their guiding light, only to discover that something someone told me long ago is absolutely true. That is, parenting is like vitamin C. A little bit is necessary. Beyond that, it really doesn't make much difference, okay? So I've given them as much as I can. I don't know what sticks. But one of the things that I'm constantly telling them is when they talk about something and they say these fateful words, there ought to be a law. I stop them and I say, wait a minute, let's just explore the consequences of your thought there. What if I don't agree and don't agree with your law? What if I don't follow your law? What happens? He says, you'll be fined. That's right. What if I don't agree with the fine? Well, they'll fine you more. That's right. What if I refuse to pay the double fines? Well, they'll show up at your house with a lien or a warrant. What if I refuse to leave my house? Well, then they'll send in the police. And what if I refuse the police? They might shoot you. Is that point so important that you're willing to use violence, deadly force against another person? They always say, no. Okay, issue drop. Only two ways to build a fortune. One is to earn it. One is to steal it. Bastiat on business number 3. To be successful, you must rely on the talents of others. Now, the president was recently roundly criticized when he told someone, you didn't build that yourself. I don't think he meant the same thing that Bastiat means. Bastiat means you can't build it yourself. You shouldn't try to build it yourself. You should trade with others who can do other things to support you while you are supporting them. In other words, comparative advantage. You are good at some things, and you should hire someone or cut a deal with someone to do the things that you're not very good at or don't have time for. By the way, another story about my children. My youngest son came to me one time and he said, Dad, I really don't like math. I really don't like math. Do you do a lot of math in your job? I said, yes, I do a lot of math in my job. He goes, oh, then I don't want to do your job. And I said, well, if you're really good at what you do, you know, you can hire someone to do the job you don't like. He said, really? I said, yes, you can hire someone to do the job you don't like. He said, that's what I want to do. So, be careful. To be successful, you must rely on the talents of others. 2 examples from Bastiat's writing, his famous Petition of the Candle Makers, where he actually petitions the French legislature in a satirical essay on behalf of the candle makers of France to require individuals to close their shutters during the day so the French candle makers can sell more candles. Because the candle makers were suffering competition from a foreign subsidized producer called the sun. Not out of the question, I can see it happening, but the point here is French industry was facing competition from overseas that could do whatever they were trying to do cheaper and better. Bastiat's point is then buy it cheaper and buy it better. Free trade will solve the problem, protection will not. Bastiat on business number 4, unchecked plunder. Unchecked plunder. If you allow plunder to run, you look the other way, can and has destroyed everything people love. Not just money, but everything people love. In the book, The Law, he points out that the United States in the 1850s, in the early 19th century, has done nearly everything right. He said it is the country that finally got almost everything right with its law. Almost everything. He holds it up as a shining example to the rest of the world, except for 2 things. And he says, prophetically, these 2 things could destroy the country. One was tariffs, and the other was slavery. And both of those nearly destroyed the country. So, Bastiat on business, unchecked plunder can destroy everything you love. Number 5. I will go back to your opening comments, John. Be careful around those who seek political power. Bastiat was skeptical of political power. He was especially skeptical of those he called great men. Sometimes you hear someone say, we need a great leader or a great man. We need someone who will take charge. I'm not so sure about that. Bastiat said, there are too many great men in the world. Legislators, organizers, do-gooders, leaders of the people, fathers of nations, and so on and so on. Too many persons place themselves above mankind. They make a career of organizing it, patronizing it, and ruling it. Be careful around those who seek political power. Bastiat on business number 6. Don't be afraid to fight for what is right and what is true. He always did. And he said, the worst thing that can happen to a good cause is not that it is skillfully attacked, but that it is ineptly defended. Bastiat on business number 7. It is essential that you learn to communicate your ideas clearly. Reading, writing, public speaking, which I hope I'm doing today. You can tell me later if I did. Learning how to tell a memorable story. Bastiat was a master at finding a short, simple story that conveyed the idea and made it unforgettable. I'm going to go even further back than Bastiat right now, all the way back to the New Testament. Jesus wrote nothing. Jesus did not answer with scholarly theology. When somebody asked Jesus a question, his most common response was, let me tell you a story. And these stories were so unforgettable, we still tell them today. That's how you communicate ideas. And the last thing on Bastiat on business, be positive and use humor. Again, I use the example of the petition of the candle makers. There are many examples like this. Unfortunately, French humor is a bit difficult to translate. But 2 more examples. There was a railroad they were trying to build in France. And it was going from point A to point B. And every little village between point A and point B wanted the train to stop in its village because it would be good for economic development. Can't you just see the Chamber of Commerce saying, we want to stop here. We need a stop here. Oh, well, we're going to have a stop here. So Bastiat's famous essay came out, and he said, listen, I can solve this problem because if you put so many stops between point A and point B, the train won't go anywhere, right? So we just won't build the railroad, and we'll call it a negative railroad. So we'll have a railroad that's not a railroad, and it solves the problem. Excellent satire. And then the last thing is there was a law. They wanted to restrict the work week. They wanted to restrict working hours. They basically wanted to increase employment, decrease unemployment by limiting the amount of labor that you could do. Bastiat's famous explanation was, well, we should just tie one hand behind everybody's back. And that way they could only work with one hand. That would slow them down and we'd have more employment for everybody. So that's some of the examples of the fun that you will have reading Bastiat. If you're interested in Bastiat, the law is an excellent introduction. Liberty Fund in Indianapolis, which I'm privileged to serve on the board of, is publishing the first ever complete works of Bastiat in English translation. So far we've come out with three volumes, I believe. And so if you're interested in the full set of Bastiat, again, never before in English has this all been collected in one place. There will be ultimately 6 volumes of his writings. I would encourage you to check out libertyfund.org. It's in Indianapolis, a massive publishing program, and we also do conferences around the world. Again, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here. If the weather does not improve, I may be here another day or two.
Another week.
Another week.
We'll take questions from the audience.
We will take some questions from the audience. Thank you.
You said early on, the important thing is to get the right social order.
Yes.
How do you get that?
Excellent question. I'm going to shift gears from Bastiat for a moment, and I'm going to tell you a story that occurred at the end of World War II. At the end of World War II, there was a young RAF pilot named Anthony Fisher. Has anyone in here heard of Sir Anthony Fisher? Good. Sir Anthony Fisher was decommissioned, and he was looking at his country spiraling towards socialism, or worse, and he was appalled. He came across a Reader's Digest condensed version, not even the full version, but a Reader's Digest condensed version of a book by Friedrich Hayek, and the title was The Road to Serfdom. He read The Road to Serfdom. He was so inspired at the Reader's Digest condensed version. I just can't get over the fact that he had to read a condensed version. Again, it was short enough to keep his interest. He went to see Hayek, who was at the London School of Economics, the LSE. And he walked into Hayek's office, and I wasn't there, but I like to imagine that this is how it occurred. I read your book. I agree with it. I want to change the world. I'm going to run for office. I like to think Hayek said, for God's sake, don't do that. He says, we don't need anyone running for office to change the world. We need a think tank that will build up the case for these ideas and circulate them in the world until the world is ready for them. And you have someone who can take those ideas and a populace that is ready to embrace those ideas and try those ideas, and then you can change the world. That's how you change the culture. So he did that. Sir Anthony Fisher left. He didn't run for office. He did something very unusual. He became a chicken farmer. He was the first modern chicken farmer in the UK. He built a chicken farming business, sold it, and then with the capital, he started and founded the IEA, the Institute for Economic Affairs, the first free market think tank in Europe in 1957. They started a publishing series, bringing out works, circulating ideas, holding conferences. And in 1974, I think it was, Margaret Thatcher was elected. Could that be right, 1974? 78, 1978. 1974, I think she attended. 1978, she was elected prime minister. And she, I've got the words. She became prime minister in 1979. She brought the ideas of IEA into the political realm. The nation was ready to try them. After she became prime minister, she wrote the following note to Sir Anthony Fisher. You created the atmosphere which made our victory possible. That's how you change the operating system. That's how you change the culture.
Next question over here.
Since Bastiat departed from the scene right as Marx was appearing, but the labor theory of value goes back to Adam Smith, did Bastiat write at all on the labor theory of value or on monetary issues in terms of what would be considered right of, obviously the Bank of England existed at that time, but I'm not sure. With the French experience with John Law, it was rather turbulent in that regard.
That's a good question. I don't know. I'm not a Bastiat scholar. I'm just a Bastiat dilettante. But I don't know that he addressed monetary issues. Right offhand, I don't recall reading about them. And I don't recall him writing about the labor theory of value. I will say this, that Scottish English tradition viewed the world a little bit differently than the European and the French tradition. Specifically, they differed on things like the theory of value and the source of human rights. Bastiat was convinced that human rights, the dignity of the human, came from God, and that it was an inalienable right that could not be taken away by any other person for any other reason. He was you might call him a hardcore individualist. But I'm sorry, I don't know the answer to the question. I will tell you this, Karl Marx detested Bastiat. He detested him. He called him all kinds of ugly names. I can't remember them all right now. A sham economist, a dwarf economist. I think he did call him a dwarf economist. So he detested Bastiat. He called him a bagman for the bourgeoisie.
Back here, next question.
I've heard you mention Hayek a couple of times, and I think you actually were referring to intellectuals and socialism at one point, maybe in how you were explaining the importance of having the think tanks, the individuals with influence in society making these kinds of recommendations. Then going into Bastiat, in that which is seen and that which is unseen, how do we really convey those messages about the importance of realizing the unforeseen consequences of economic policy to these intellectuals, as Hayek would put it, and trying to get that mentality change to our society?
It's a very good question, too. I can't answer universally. I can only answer for myself, and I can tell you that I think humility is the key, recognizing the limits of human capacity and the limits of human knowledge, and I think Hayek was a very, very powerful voice for humility. He encouraged people to step back and really consider whether we have the knowledge to make this happen or not. If Hayek were here or Bastiat were here, we could take up the example, for example, of climate change. And on that topic, I think the evidence is very clear. The climate is changing. The climate has always been changing. The climate will continue to change. The planet changes. That's just the way the planet is. The question is, do we have the intelligence to manage the change? And I think when you put that on the table, it suddenly becomes clear we don't. Some type of intellectual humility so that you're not tempted to take on these monster tasks, I think is required. If you can't make it rain where you want it to rain, how are you going to manage the climate? You can't. I find that logically impossible.
Over here, next question.
Thank you for introducing us to Bastiat. I had not heard of him before. And when you started giving his quotes, I thought you were quoting Voltaire. Did Voltaire have anything to do with Bastiat? You know, one read the other. It's kind of like Aristotle and Plato.
It's a good question. Voltaire preceded Bastiat. Was a member of the Enlightenment. Bastiat, I don't recall him mentioning Voltaire, but in the online Library of Liberty, if you are interested in this, you go to the online Library of Liberty, you have the complete searchable database of the Bastiat works. So you can go see what did Bastiat say about Voltaire. Good question.
Any other questions?
This is my hearing. I did not hear the give a website for the volumes. I didn't.
It's at libertyfund.org.
Liberty Fund.
Liberty fund, F-U-N-D.org. At libertyfund.org, you'll find an extensive library of publications.
So as I understand, part of what you're trying to do with Bastiat Society is to make businessmen more articulate in defense of capitalism and through education. And would you like to say how that effort's going?
That is exactly what we're trying to do. That's why our motto is those who work in freedom should know how freedom works. And so if you are privileged enough to create prosperity for yourself and the people you love, for the societies and the towns you live in, you should understand the source of that. What is the source of prosperity? It's also, by the way, the source of human happiness, mutually beneficial exchange, and nonviolent societies. Those are the things business people should understand. And it not only makes them, I think, better business people, you might even argue it helps their human development, but I think it also makes them better prepared to defend themselves when they're attacked as greedy capitalists, as they were in Venezuela, where the shopkeepers were rounded up and called bourgeoisie, and their shops were shut down. Venezuela is the opposite of everything that we want to accomplish. We want to move in the other direction towards the economic harmony of Bastiat. And you can only do that with some type of worldview. And the worldview has to be this kind of humble but mutually beneficial world of market exchange.
So when I try to defend capitalism, free markets, and the profit motive as the best way to get things done, people say, well, Bob, that just doesn't work for everybody. Us libertarians, there's a running joke about, well, who will build the roads, you know, there's that. But they're telling us, well, you can't apply capitalism and the profit motive to the teaching of Kansas school children. Only government can do that. If businessmen get in the business of providing schools, they will just pay teachers nothing. They will charge as much as they can. They will do everything they can to squeeze out a profit, and the kids will learn nothing. I don't believe that. That's what people say.
That is what they will say. By the way, Bastiat addresses that point in the law. And he says, when you say that you're against the state building a road, they say you're against roads. Okay? When they say you're against the state providing that kind of aid for the poor, you're against all aid for the poor. When you're against subsidizing or protecting the candle makers, you don't like trade. So it's that same argument that we've had for a very long time, not an unusual one. Bastiat can help you be an effective voice against that. One last thing is I would encourage you to use words that aren't politically charged. I'm as guilty as anyone else of loving the word capitalism. I think it's a very fair description of what it is and what we do. Unfortunately, the rest of the world is using the word in a different way. And you have two choices here. You can either insist on using the word the way you want it, or you can adjust to the way the world uses it. And so sometimes you can diffuse the situation by using the word prosperity as opposed to capitalism. It's just one suggestion.
Next question.
You referred to law creating social behavior. What does Bastiat say in the area of using tax policy to direct that kind of behavior?
Bastiat was a hardcore individual rights guy. And he said, you know, anytime that you take money out of one person's pocket and give it to another, you have committed an act of plunder. I have heard that he was in favor of something around a 5% tariff. That was the way he funded the state. So he recognized that there are certain governmental necessities that had to be funded, would have to be funded. But he was a real hardcore, bright line kind of guy. If you take $1 out of one person's pocket against his will and put it in another person's pocket, you have committed an act of plunder.
The G word of government, once again, borrow, 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 live for today, kick the can down the road for our kids and grandkids. How do we stop that, and how did it get this far, where we cut this trillions of debt? I mean, were we asleep at the wheel? How did that ever happen?
Wow, I don't know if I'm qualified to answer that one. That's a big question. All I can tell you is the optimists rarely have a set of facts on their side. We just believe that things will get better, but I don't know that I can answer that one.
Next question over here.
Okay, well, I have an uncomfortable position on the subject of law regulating commerce and causing massive debt. I was born in Alva, Oklahoma, which is right down the road from where these earthquakes took place recently. And most of my family is farming families. And I'm a very strong supporter of industrial hemp. And due to the prohibition of cannabis and marijuana located in our prisons and preventing the exploitation of this hemp as an industrial feedstock, I strongly feel that we created a huge mess, and it gets into this government laws regulating so on and so forth. And I'll leave it at that. I'm sorry, but I know it's a very controversial subject, but I've been working on this now for 40 years. So thank you for your attention. And I enjoyed your talk very much.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, one more.
You mentioned that wealth usually comes from either thievery or work. Well, what about inheritance?
I would say then that's wealth that somebody else worked for or stole.
Would you describe Bastiat as being more out of the French physiocrat school in terms of economics, or more out of the Adam Smith school and why?
But, well, because he was French. Yeah, he definitely came out of that continental school.
Last chance, any other questions? I get closer to John. What do you guys think?
Thank you. What is the one thing you would suggest we could do today to change the situation?
You and I and everyone in the room may not live long enough to see that. I believe in slow change. The ideas have to be circulated. They have to get into the operating system of citizens. Meetings like this one, organizations like the Bastiat Society, it's all about keeping the ideas in circulation. Milton Friedman was once asked that question back in the 1970s, I believe. Yeah, I think it was in the 70s. And his answer was, the job of the scholar is to keep the ideas at hand, so when the moment for them comes, they can be delivered coherent and intact. So that's what I would say. You take a long-term approach, promote the ideas, defend the market, concentrate on that, and I think good things will happen. I just can't tell you when.
Right here.
Following that, apparently early on in our history as a country, we had everything except two things right. Correct. Somewhere we must have gotten off track in that slow progression. Can you identify that period or those things that happened?
I'm reminded of a book that a legal scholar has published, Richard Epstein. Richard Epstein, who's now at NYU, used to be at the University of Chicago, and he published a book, and the name of the book is How the Progressives Stole the Constitution. And so that might be a useful examination about how things went wrong. Another very interesting essay that I'm trying to remember the name of, but I can't right now, says it was the Civil War which radically changed the relationship between the citizen and Washington. The name escapes me right now. If you see me later, I might be able to dredge it up. Thank you.